All right. Hello, everyone. Good day, as we say it in Australia. Welcome back to our CAUSINDYTalk. My name is Agung Kurniawan, and you can call me Jess Agung. And I will be the host for today's second episode of CAUSINDYTalk. The title of our talk is Bridging Australia-Indonesia Through Language, Culture, and Connection. In this episode, we will dive into the exciting world of education and innovation with a special focus on our upcoming conference, Expanding Horizons, Advancing Innovation and Education in the Australia-Indonesia Relationship. Please stay tuned on our social media channels at CAUSINDY on our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as our website at www.causindy.org for more exciting news about the conference. On today's episode, we will delve into the fascinating world of language, culture, and the unique bonds between Australia and Indonesia and how they unite these two countries. And we're thrilled to have the esteemed Dr. Jess Kruk join us today. Welcome, Dr. Jess. Dr. Jess is a very passionate social linguist and a lecturer at the University of Western Australia in Perth. Dr. Jess brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion. Her research on language and social identity, particularly with ethnic minority communities, has garnered widespread recognition across both countries. Jess has conducted groundbreaking work on the role of language in negotiating ethnic identity among ethnic Chinese youth in West Kalimantan. Dr. Jess, remind me of the capital of West Kalimantan again?
That would be Pontianak.
Perfect. You still recall this place very fondly, yeah?
Of course.
That's amazing. There you go. So Dr. Jess' insights into this complex topic offer valuable perspectives on the intersection of language, education, and cultural identity. So once again, welcome, Dr. Jess Kruk. Thank you for being here with us today. It is such a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So without further ado, maybe we can just start the talk, I would say. This isn't an interview, Dr. Ya. So we're going to have a casual talk on this topic to make it easier for our listeners to understand. So Dr. Jess, could you please share with our listeners a bit about your personal journey into this field of social linguistics and how your interest in language and identity developed?
Yeah, of course. So I was primarily drawn to sociolinguistics because I'm interested in how people use language in context and how language is used to structure and navigate our social worlds. So a lot of us know that language kind of reflects aspects of who we are. Like, so for example, when you hear my accent, most people will know that I'm from Australia. But more than this, language is also the kind of primary medium through which we actively create and present our identities. So, for instance, choosing to use or avoid linguistic jargon could variably highlight my expertise in this field or else disguise it. And this could create social alignment or social distance depending on the context. So ultimately, language then kind of shapes the social dynamics of interaction. And it's all of these kind of choices about when, how, and why people use language to do identity work that I'm really interested in.
Oh wow, that's a very interesting answer, because I myself speak a few languages, and that is true. It shapes my identity whenever I choose the language in which I speak. So how about your academic background, Dr. Jess? How did it prepare you for your current research in this field?
Yeah. Well, so I did my undergraduate at Monash University, and I majored in Indonesian and Chinese languages. And of course, I studied linguistics as well. And so this kind of gave me the academic grounding, at least, to do a lot of the research that I've ended up focusing on for particularly the earlier part of my career, looking at Chinese minorities in Indonesia, in particular in West Kalimantan, as you said earlier.
Oh, wow. Allow me to to dig into that experience of yours a bit. So you said that you were in Pontianak before, yeah? Was it in Pontianak though?
Yeah,
How
Pontianak.
long were you? Oh, that's amazing. I myself, to be honest, I've never been there. But how long were you there, Dr. Jess?
So I was there for 7 or 8 months in total. And this is back in 2015. So obviously things have changed a bit since then. But yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear Pontianak, will kind of be surprised to learn that there's any research to be done in the area, just because it's a very kind of peripheral community in Indonesia. Even for domestic travel, there's not a lot of people going to Pontianak outside of, just for work. I'd say the majority of travel to Pontianak is within West Kalimantan. People coming from the regions to the capital city in order to kind of pursue work or education and those kinds of things. And of course, while I was there was certainly, I think, for the entire 7-8 months that I was there, I think I saw maybe 2 non-Indonesian people other than myself. So it's certainly not a tourist destination, but it's a fascinating place to visit. I would certainly recommend it.
I guess that's how you learn the most, right? You jump into this
exactly.
extremely, how do I say it, uncommon field, uncommon ground to learn and to nurture yourself, basically. Did you get to use your Chinese a bit when you were in West Kalimantan?
A little bit, predominantly in a Mandarin language class at the university where I ended up doing my data collection. Otherwise, the languages that are spoken in that community, though, by Chinese people themselves are certainly not the Chinese languages that I was already familiar with, unfortunately. So Mandarin is not spoken. Instead, it's Kek and Teotzal. So, but I did learn a bit of those languages just while I was there, like living in the community and stuff. But I didn't get to use my Mandarin very much, unfortunately.
But you used your Indonesian, of course. Although
of course.
I do reckon that in West Kalimantan or in some parts of Kalimantan, people do speak Indonesian with a bit of Malay accent or dialect. Yeah. Did you have any difficulties in that?
Yeah, I think like when I first got there in particular, I mean, I'd say Pontianak Malay, the less like Kental version at least, is pretty accessible to speakers of like just the national language. But obviously there are kind of versions or varieties of Pontianak Malay that like I absolutely cannot access. But at least in terms of like the accent, like once I kind of got my head around it, I found it a little bit easier. It's even just very simple things like instead of saya, it's saya, mau ke mana, like that kind of thing is very typical of like Pontianak Malay. So kind of getting used to
that's amazing.
An adjustment.
That's amazing. But your Indonesian is still very Indonesian, so that is perfect. So well done on surviving the accent in West Kalimantan. Moving forward, Dr. Jess, so you have conducted extensive research on ethnic Chinese youth in West Kalimantan. What drew you to this particular community, and what were your primary research goal when in West Kalimantan?
So I suppose I could say that I had both personal and academic motivations. I mean, most simply, obviously because of my academic background, I did want to draw together skills and expertise that I'd gained in Chinese and Indonesian languages as well as linguistics. And so, drawing together those skill sets, I really wanted to explore what it meant to be Chinese in Indonesia today, and what the role of language was in structuring, Chineseness in the Indonesian context. And the reason that I was interested in this is because a lot of the existing work on Chinese Indonesians that I had read prior to actually going to West Kalimantan was conducted in Java, and most of it was conducted a good, 20 years prior to my arrival in West Kalimantan. And a lot of it kind of suggested that Chinese people, particularly young Chinese Indonesians, had become kind of Indonesianized or Cina coret, yeah. So they no longer use like Chinese languages, didn't identify as being kind of Chinese at all, really, other than in terms of their like ancestry or keturunan, yeah. So that I kind of wanted to investigate whether or not that was true of communities outside of Java. And from what I had read, I'd kind of seen these little references here and there kind of suggesting that maybe communities in West Kalimantan and in Pontianak in particular were still maintaining their Chinese languages, but it didn't really seem like anyone had any kind of strong idea of whether or not that was actually happening or how it was happening or anything like that. So that's primarily what I wanted to investigate. And from a personal kind of perspective, I think over the course of doing this work, I did end up, creating a lot of like relationships, friendships with Chinese Indonesians in Pontianak that I've maintained to this day, some 10 years later. And that I think has kind of motivated me to kind of continue doing work on, this language and community. And it's also kind of helped me connect with other people in my life. Like my stepmother is Chinese Mauritian. And, when I talked to her about kind of doing this work on Chinese diaspora in Indonesia, it kind of led her to kind of talk to me about like her life growing up Chinese in Mauritius and how there were kind of similarities in the experiences of people that I'd met in Indonesia and, those in Mauritius as well. So I think like that's kind of the wonderful thing about research is that it is an opportunity for connection.
Wow. That's actually very fascinating to know that Australia itself is a very multicultural and diverse community. I could say one of the most diverse communities in the world, really. And your interest in this complexity between language and identity among ethnicities in Indonesia. Do you have any further perspective on that, on how these two aspects play?
Yeah, I mean, to Indonesian listeners, this probably won't be new information, but to anyone who's not kind of familiar with how, language and identity kind of work in Indonesia, I think it's important to kind of note that, the history of Indonesian language policy that was introduced during the Suharto era created this kind of single national language that effectively repositioned the other 700 or so languages in Indonesia as kind of regional or ethnic languages and kind of confined their use to these kind of regional and ethnic contexts. But as an unexpected consequence of this, a lot of those languages that ended up being labelled as regional and ethnic languages ended up becoming very strongly associated with ethnic and regional identities, so much so that, in many parts of Indonesia now, they've become kind of symbolic of regional and ethnic identities. So, for instance, when people talk about, a Pontianak Malay or, Teochew and Kek in the case of Chinese languages, they're not, just languages that happen to be spoken, by a particular community or within a particular region, but they also kind of communicate this sense of kind of solidarity and belonging to particular kind of regional and ethnic communities.
Okay, that's amazing. Because if I can bring in my personal background a bit, I am actually half Chinese. So my mom is actually from Central Aceh. It's an area called Takengon in Central Aceh. Some Indonesians might have heard of Kopi Gayo. So Gayo is actually an area, a highland in the central area of Aceh. And my dad is Chinese from North Sumatra. And as you said earlier, I can easily identify myself as a Chinese coret because all my life, I've grown up being Indonesian, really. I don't even speak the language. Even my dad doesn't necessarily speak the language anymore, but he can understand. However, we're here. We're Indonesians now, as in we speak this language that eventually unified the whole country from 700 languages that you mentioned earlier during Suharto era. So, about your research in West Kalimantan, Dr. Jess, did you have any challenges and opportunities that you saw this young Chinese community in West Kalimantan face when you were there?
Yeah, I think fundamentally they experience these kind of competing pressures. So, on the one hand, Chinese languages and Chinese identity itself have historically and even currently, given like research that people like Charlotte Setigyadi have done in Indonesia, have been viewed as kind of incompatible with Indonesian identity and culture. And like I said, unfortunately, these attitudes have endured till today. So there's this pressure that a lot of young people experience to kind of prove that they are integrated into Indonesian society and that they are Indonesians, which they do also consider themselves to be. So as much as they identify as being Chinese, they also identify as being Indonesian. All the people that I spoke to in Pontianak were born in Pontianak or in Indonesia. So they are still Indonesians, but I think they do feel pressure still to avoid, practicing Chinese culture and speaking Chinese languages in view of non-Chinese people for fear of like being discriminated against or fear of being viewed as kind of exclusive or, insular and that kind of thing. But at the same time, because of the history of Chinese language oppression and the ongoing shift towards Indonesian, Pontianak Chinese communities are also really concerned about maintaining Chinese languages. So there's also pressure coming from inside the community to actively use Chinese language in daily life. Like a lot of the people that I spoke to talked about, their parents and grandparents kind of really like ensuring that they use Chinese languages and stuff like that. If they use Indonesian, it's like, oh, kamu orang apa ya? Like, so, who are you? Have you forgotten your Chineseness? That kind of idea.
Know your background. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's very relatable to me because I have my kuku, we call it in tech Chinese, as in auntie, auntie from my dad. So my dad's sister, I call her kuku. My kuku always reminds me to know all this Chinese culture. She would bring me to Chinese temples or Buddhist temples and taught me how to enter a temple politely, knowing the history of Dewi Kuan Yin or Guan Yu and all these Chinese heroes and figures, really. So I can totally relate to that, Dr. Jess. That's very interesting. So about when you were in West Kalimantan, I can say that Chinese communities in general in Indonesia are not really big. So in certain areas, they are okay, as in they're quite widespread. But in some areas, in most areas in Indonesia, they're very, how do I say it, centralized and in a way marginalized, right? So why do you think it's important to involve marginalized people from all walks of life in advancing education? Let's say in Indonesia or based on your experience in Australia?
Yeah, well, I think across both contexts, very simply, it's really the only way we can actually ensure that education is accessible to marginalised people, because without consulting with marginalised people about their needs and the kind of barriers that they encounter when trying to access and pursue education at different levels, it can be very difficult to then kind of create strategies to alleviate these issues, because different marginalised communities are going to encounter different kinds of barriers. They're going to, encounter different kinds of problems. And of course, I think the other thing is that, if we think about, theories of identity like intersectionality that's been talked about a lot recently, I think that's a very useful way of thinking about how, various kind of trajectories of marginalisation are often kind of overlapping, but also kind of mutually constitutive. And what I mean by that is that it's usually not just one type of marginalisation that a given person experiences. It's usually multiple, and they all kind of interact in different ways. And so this is a very kind of long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of complexity when it comes to kind of marginalised experiences. And so in trying to create education that speaks to all of the different people that make up our societies, whether that be Australia or Indonesia, we do really need to be in kind of community with those people to, work out how we can best cater to the most marginalised person in society, so that then everybody else is also taken care of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The way that marginalized people receive pressures from so many aspects in even maintaining their identity, or like we said, they're just as small as their language, really. That eventually, if we tackle that, we can say we can bring in the inclusivity into the education. Definitely. So how can we ensure that education systems in Indonesia and Australia are inclusive, like I said previously, Dr. Jess, and equitable for all students, regardless of their background or their ethnicities, their language?
Yeah, it is difficult to do, and there's so many kind of different things that have to work in concert in order for our education systems to be inclusive and equitable to all people. However, as a linguist, obviously, I can speak to my area of expertise, which is language. So for me, I would say that, an important issue is ensuring that all students have access to education in a language that they understand. Not just the standard national language, but also their kind of primary language or mother tongue. As we see consistently that students who have access to mother tongue education have better educational outcomes than students who don't, because they don't have to, deal with the additional difficulty of trying to access the unknown through the unknown. So, trying to gain new information through a language that they already struggle to understand is obviously a very kind of difficult experience to negotiate. The other thing is that, both our nations now support the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which do state that Indigenous people have the right to revitalise, use, develop and transmit Indigenous languages to future generations. They have the right to establish, control and access educational systems and institutions in Indigenous languages, and they have the right to establish media in Indigenous languages as well. And UNDRIP kind of suggests that all of these initiatives should be Indigenous-led, which, of course, I generally support, but I'm also kind of aware of the fact that that places a lot of the burden on sometimes marginalised Indigenous groups to develop, maintain, and then kind of defend their own languages. So I think there also needs to be some, government support so that Indigenous-led initiatives and programs, can actually be sustainable.
Dr. Jess, the initial answer to my question that you had, I feel very attacked in a way that I learned. So I studied not in Indonesia. I pursued my degree in Europe, and I enrolled all my courses in a non-English or Indonesian language. It was in French, actually. So I totally felt the difficulties in even trying to understand what my professors were saying. When I had law as one of my classes, it was hard. Gosh, it was hard. I had never learned law in even English, neither Indonesian, and I had to learn law straight away in French. So recorder every day, listening to these records every night, to trying to simply understand what were they saying. So I feel very attacked. So thank you for thank you for understanding us, the foreign students. And you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right about how the governments play very important role in trying to help marginalized communities in giving them access to education, like how equal it is supposed to be for all communities. So thank you, Dr. Jess, on that. Given the significant role of youth in shaping the future, as we agree, how can we empower young people to become active agents of change in advancing education, you guess, in Australia and Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the kind of simple answer is that, in providing access to quality education in their languages, creating job opportunities and fostering kind of inclusive environments, this all kind of creates the conditions to empower students to then become active agents of change and advance our education systems. But I think, beyond these kind of broad platitudes, I think it's also important to highlight where students have the opportunity to contribute to ongoing change. So to give a kind of personal example, I tell my students, my Indonesian students all the time that, in studying Indonesian at an Australian university, they have the opportunity to assist with the reinvigoration of Australian language studies in Indonesia, and they can bring their young perspectives, experiences and insights to the creation of materials and strategies that will better engage young Australians and motivate them to continue learning Indonesian and help strengthen our bilateral relationships. And then for my linguistic students, I try and kind of give them insight into how they can use even just simple linguistic knowledge to address a lot of harmful misinformation about language in Australia, particularly because Australia really suffers from like a monolingual mindset, as I'm sure you know. So, even just simple things like, educating people around you that, everyone has an accent. And that having a foreign English accent, quote unquote, is not indicative of like a lack of understanding of English. Those kinds of, I think, very just simple ideas are really important for kind of breaking down accent bias, for instance, right? Which has like real world effects on, the employability of, migrants and people from non-English speaking backgrounds who do speak English with a non-Australian accent.
Wow. How do I say it? You hit the nail on the head, really, sir, Dr. Jess, because I think we all agree that we can relate to that, especially you know Indonesia like the back of your hand, really. I can say you know very well that accent is an important thing in Indonesia when people speak in English, for example, with a very thick Javanese accent, for example, they can be regarded less by the communities, and that is not true. That is not true. Accent is not the shaping factor of how good your language is, of how can you understand the language. Just like in Australia, for example, people speak English with various accents from various backgrounds. So that has nothing to do with it. So, Dr. Jess, thank you for that insight. So, Australia and Indonesia, Dr. Jess, you know these countries very well. We both have a very strong partnership in education. These two countries have strong partnership in education. Can you highlight some of the key initiatives, such as Australia-Indonesia partnership towards an inclusive society, for example, when it comes to language, connection, and identity, like we talked previously?
Yeah, well, the Australian-Indonesia Partnership Towards Inclusive Society, or INCLUS, yeah. Yeah, INCLUS. I like the Indonesian term because it's nice. Yeah, a nice summary term. Well, that's obviously a really, really important partnership for ensuring that marginalised people have greater access to services that are going to improve their livelihoods. And we saw this was especially important in the wake of COVID-19, where we saw that marginalised people in both of our countries were the most severely impacted by the pandemic, because they already struggle to access social, economic, political, and obviously in the case of COVID, health services. So, this is a really important partnership so that we can kind of draw our resources together and work on, what are, common challenges across our two nations. And, ongoing marginalisation of minoritised communities is a challenge that both our nations are going to have to reckon with if we want to create more inclusive societies. I'd say the other thing that some other programs I think that are really important for strengthening the kind of bilateral relationships and strengthening education in both of our nations are, for instance, the New Colombo Plan, which aims to enhance Australia's knowledge of the Indo-Pacific region and particularly Indonesia by supporting Australian undergraduates to undertake study, language training and internships in the region. So I've certainly had a lot of students travelling to Indonesia under the new Colombo plan, where they've got scholarships to stay for up to I think it's a year, and improve their Indonesian language, learn more about Indonesian culture and society, and at the same time, gain some practical skills that can help them in their future careers. And, from the Indonesian side as well, we have the Indonesian Language Learning Ambassadors Program that places postgraduate students from Indonesia in contact with Australian students studying Indonesian. So this obviously helps Australian students get more exposed to kind of the diversity of Indonesian cultures, accents and languages, and helps Indonesian students here kind of learn firsthand about Australian culture, community, classroom teaching practices and so on. So I think what's great about ILA and the new Colombo plan are both of them kind of promote exchange and collaboration across Australia and Indonesia. And, more importantly, I think, form connections between young Indonesians and young Australians who are ultimately, going to be shaping our societies.
Right, that's a great point, Dr. Jess. However, I do know that New Colombo Plan is, I would say, slightly centralized in Java, or
that is true.
Only in some parts of Indonesia. So I think it'd be great to have the New Colombo Plan, for example, send their students widespread across Indonesia to even some parts of eastern Indonesia, because, like you said previously, little did Australia know about West Kalimantan, for example, because people or communities in West Kalimantan or in Java are completely different in terms of their identity or even their language, for example.
Yeah.
And having the exchange between these communities and exhibiting to the world through these New Colombo students on how Indonesia are actually as diverse as Australia, let's say, is very important.
Yeah, and that's such a good point as well, because you're totally right. Like, I mean, even within Australia, I think the majority of contact that Australians have with Indonesia outside of just Bali is with Java and Javanese people. Like, the vast majority of Indonesian teachers from Indonesia are Javanese people. A lot of the kind of cultural like symbols and stuff of Indonesia tend to be of Javanese origin. And so in a lot of Australians' minds, they do kind of tend to think of Indonesian culture as Javanese. And, this is a larger problem of like Javanization of Indonesia and that kind of thing. But I think it's such a good point, though. It would be really great for students to travel outside of Java and get to see just how vastly different, different communities in Indonesia can be. Because, I mean, as you know, traveling to another island in Indonesia is almost like going to a different country, right?
There you go. You are completely right. I think that brings us to our next question about challenges in having partnerships between Australia and Indonesia. How do you see, what challenges, Dr. Jess, do you see in us partnering in education?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I mean, obviously, I'd say we need to do more work in kind of creating more opportunities for mobility across our countries, putting Australians and Indonesians in contact with one another to kind of create more opportunities for collaboration in teaching, training, research. And so certainly programs like, the new Colombo plan are a good kind of starting point, but we do need to, go beyond this in order to make sure that a greater variety of Australians and Indonesians are in contact, not just people in the major cities of Australia and, of course, in Java and Indonesia. And I think the other thing that we really need to do, at least from the Australia end of things, is promote opportunities for young people in Australia to have connections with young people in Indonesia and see what Indonesia is actually like, particularly because, as I'm sure you know, Australia has very low Indonesia literacy. Most people's knowledge of Indonesia begins and ends with Bali, let alone Java.
Yeah.
And there's very limited knowledge of Indonesia's political system, cultural life, and the role that the Indonesian economy and the tech industry are going to play in Australia in the years to come. And again, even just the diversity of Indonesian languages and cultures is not something that's widely known. So I think even if people aren't physically going to Indonesia, I think we do need better kind of media representation in Australia of Indonesia so that people have a more kind of accurate idea of Indonesia as a society.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Because I can see how the Australian government nowadays tries to involve media by inviting them to come to Australia and to see how Australia is, and to eventually get a coverage of how Australia is, to bring back to Indonesia and tell the Indonesians about, hey, this is Australia. It's beyond kangaroo and koala that you guys know of, for example.
Yeah.
And that could be an initiative that the Indonesian government can do as well, by bringing in some Australian journalists, for example, to have a media coverage of how Indonesian society is really. So that's a great
idea, particularly because we know that the average Indonesian person has much better knowledge of Australia than Australians do of Indonesia. So that speaks to the success, though, of having greater media representation of one's neighbour, right? In just enhancing general knowledge of each of our neighbours.
And another platform to facilitate that, for example, Dr. Jess, is CAUSINDY. We hold conference, for example, for Indonesian and Australian youth to have a knowledge and experience exchange really on how their countries are, so that we have better representations, like you said.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Jess, recap points is definitely about our Australia and Indonesia collaboration, in this field. And we talked also about ideas or innovative projects in strengthening the bilateral relation between Australia and Indonesia, particularly in education, for example, for language and identity, like you mentioned, and involving youth. Like I said previously, CAUSINDY is one of the platforms to do that.
Yes, and we greatly appreciate your work in this space.
Oh, no. We honor someone like you who is an expertise in knowing both countries, to have your knowledge shared across both countries, and hopefully our listeners, our public, can better understand how they can help, how they can contribute in shaping the strong bonds that Australia and Indonesia have. So, looking ahead, Dr. Jess, what are some of the pressing education issues that you think Australia and Indonesia need to address?
Well, firstly, I think one of the difficulties that Australia and Indonesia share is that there's very unequal distribution of quality education across cities and rural towns. So that's certainly one issue that needs to be addressed, with greater infrastructure and also support for the teachers that are doing work in those rural communities. I know for a fact that rural teachers in Australia and Indonesia are doing some really wonderful work, but often are working with considerably less funding and less resources than communities in the major cities. So that's certainly one issue. And, we have to think about this in the context of, in both of our countries, a lot of students do actually need to move from regional towns to the city in order to pursue higher education. And this obviously creates, a situation of inequality. Yes, exactly.
Brain drain, we call it, yeah?
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's one issue that certainly needs to be addressed. And, in Australia as well, because of course this is a big point of focus for me, being an Indonesian language teacher, is that, of course, we need to address the Indonesian literacy issue, and also, related to this, of course, the falling student enrolments in Indonesian language classes. So Australia, for anyone who doesn't already know, of our 40 universities, only 12 now teach Indonesian language, and this is down from 22 in the 90s. And, at the same time, the experts are saying that Australia, urgently needs investment in teaching Indonesian language at schools and universities here. And this is, of course, not only to enhance our bilateral relations, but, to also ensure that, we're set up for the future where, our economy and our tech industry is going to depend a lot on collaboration with the Indonesian nation. So we really need to be, prepared for that future. And in line with that, I think, in order to ensure that students are invested in this, because it's always really hard, I find, to communicate to young people, strategic importance. I think we also need to, as I said before, just communicate to young Australians how Indonesia is actually a really cool place. And I think this is something that, like, a lot of people, like, in Australia and Indonesia are kind of frustrated with, which is that a lot of the time, like, when people kind of learn about Indonesia or Indonesian, they tend to only learn about, like, traditional culture. And of course, like, I'm not saying at all that traditional culture isn't important. It's very, rich in Indonesia. But Indonesia is also part of the modern world. It has a growing middle class. There's arguably better tech development in Indonesia than there is in Australia, especially if you consider, unicorn startups like Gojek. And there's a lot of, interesting modern cultural phenomena as well. Like, there's the growth of Indonesia's film industry that's really strong at the moment, as are, like, musical subcultures, and even coffee culture in Bali is, booming at the moment. So, I think all of these kind of aspects of modern and youth culture need to be kind of accessible for young Australians, so they can actually see how they could relate to young Indonesian people, and how, learning Indonesian language isn't just a strategic choice, but, there are actual, intrinsic reasons to, learn Indonesian language. Because, again, like, what we learn from research is that more sustainable language learning is promoted through greater intrinsic motivation. So wanting to learn a language due to a desire to connect with the culture. And how do we build that desire? By actually showing what, a diversity of Indonesian cultures, both modern and traditional, actually involve. And that's something that I'm trying to address in a lot of my own work, kind of moving forward with my own podcast that I'm developing as well, with Pak Hawi Mans over at Monash Uni, to try and explore more of Indonesian modern youth culture.
Oh, wow. That's amazing, though, Dr. Jess. Maybe you could share a bit to us where we can listen to your podcast.
Yeah, so we're recording it at the moment. It's going to be released, we hope, by the end of the year, if we can get all of that editing finalized in time. But it's called Bloody Bagus.
Wow, okay.
That's a combination of Australian, English, and Indonesian, of course. And each episode involves a little Bahasa Indonesia gaul, Bahasa gaul, and also an English language interview with someone either in Australia or Indonesia who is kind of connected to some aspect of modern Indonesian society, whether it be travel blogging in Indonesia, or youth art movements in Indonesia, even Indonesian metal, and what else? We also had an episode where we talked about, the latest election, all of these kind of different topics in Indonesia now, just to give students a more kind of up-to-date version of, what's happening in Indonesia today.
Oh, wow. That's a very noble and great thing to do, because I do agree that both Indonesian and Australian youth need more exposure of each other's identity and culture, really, because little did they know that we we both share the same issues. We youth, for example, share the same gallowness, same anxiety, same problems in dating, for example, for singles. So that happens everywhere, right, Dr. Jess?
Absolutely.
I think you're right. So exposure is a great thing we need to improve, so that the young people are aware that they're more connected than they thought they are.
Absolutely, that's it. Yeah.
Dr. Jess, I think that last question concluded our discussion today. I would like to extend CAUSINDY's sincere gratitude to Dr. Jess Kruk for your valuable insights and expertise in this field. We were fascinated. I personally was attacked a lot by your experience and how you understood the Indonesian society in general. So your work on language, identity, and education has made a significant contribution to the field. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jess. As we look to the future, it's clear that education will continue to be a driving force in shaping the destinies of both Australia and Indonesia. For our viewers, stay up to date with CAUSINDY initiatives by visiting our website at www.causindy.org. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to have more of your knowledge shared across both countries, and please keep us updated once your podcast is out.
I surely will. Terima kasih banyak ya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jess. Until next time.
Yeah, until next time. Sampai nanti ya.